It's time for us now to go to our final interview of the day. It's interview number 5. And September is Deaf Awareness Month. And to talk about this with us today is Kalinka, a genetic counselor working alongside a team of researchers at UCT on a project called Hygiene Africa, Hearing Impairment Genetic Studies Africa, which aims to determine the genetic factors contributing to hearing loss in the African population. Good morning, Kalinka, and how are you doing today?
Morning, Alex. Well, thanks, and yourself.
I'm doing great, and thank you so much for joining us. To start off, can you tell us a bit more about Deaf Awareness Month and why it's so important?
So Deaf Awareness Month occurs throughout September every year, and it's basically aimed at teaching people more about exactly what deafness is and what it entails, about deaf culture and the issues pertaining to deaf communities. So it's important for us to understand more about what exactly deafness is, and to be able to curb some of the misconceptions we have regarding the deaf communities and the way that they want to be treated by us and the way that they function. Because, for instance, deaf people don't see themselves as disabled. They see themselves as normal people who just have a different means of communication language. So this is the kind of thing that gets covered during Deaf Awareness Month.
And for all the children out there, how would you explain to them more about HR Hygiene Africa?
So Hygienes is a project in which we're trying to understand why children are born deaf or have hearing loss at a very young age. So in order to do this, we look at the DNA of people. So DNA are the instructions of our bodies that makes our body work the way that it should. But our ears have specific instructions that help us to hear properly. And in some cases, people have changes in those instructions that cause them to be deaf or to be hard of hearing. So Hygienes is on a journey to try and find exactly what those changes are that end up leading to hearing loss and how exactly those changes work. And we're doing that within the African populations.
And now the COVID-19 pandemic has affected us all. So how has it affected children with hearing loss?
So particularly when it comes to face mask wearing, people rely a lot on facial expressions and lip reading when one is deaf. So they can't do that. And if they're hard of hearing, they're unable to hear us properly because our voices are muffled with the masks. And also then with regards to schooling, children who are deaf tend to go to schools for the deaf where they have a huge support system and good interaction amongst their deaf peers and the staff, which they now don't have when they're at home, where many of them have families who aren't able to do sign language. So they've lost that support, and as well with needing to continue learning from home, it's impossible to get some assistance from a family if they're unable to communicate on those levels.
And following on from that, how has the pandemic affected your research to do with Hygiene Africa?
So one of the main things is our recruitment, where we recruit participants and get DNA samples from these individuals. We do this by going to the schools for the deaf and other places like Red Cross Hospital, where we now haven't been able to go. So our recruitment for the year has been hindered, as well as our lab work. For a time, we weren't able to access our lab, so we couldn't do our DNA extractions and preparing the samples for the analysis process.
And what advice would you give to parents who are worried that their young children might have hearing problems and also might be stressed because of the pandemic and trying to get this sorted out?
So there are some things that one can do when looking at deafness, looking at how a child reacts. For instance, if you use loud sounds, see how they react to TV, how loud they want the TV, those kind of things, to try and see how your child is reacting. And then if you do find out that a child is deaf or is not reacting as they should, it's very important to go immediately to make an appointment with a doctor or with the clinic, so that you can then be referred to an audiologist or a place like Red Cross to have your child's hearing test. Particularly through this time, don't leave everything. It's important that it gets done soon, because we know that the later you wait for a diagnosis, the worse off the management of the child will be. So don't think, okay, I'll just leave it until all the chaos has passed by during this pandemic. I'll sort it out when things are better. So don't lose hope for a child thinking that nothing can be done. There are many things for children who are deaf, such as hearing aids, cochlear implants, speech therapy, schools, all sorts of resources to help a child as best as possible. And also don't stop interacting with a child or talking to a child just because they don't react in a way that you want them to. Those kind of engagements are still important for their development on other levels.
Well, Kalinka, thank you so much for that motivation, that information, and everything that you provided with us today on the show. And good luck with the research, and thank you so much for joining me and for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
You're listening to RX Radio.
For and by children.
RX Radio. RX Radio rocks.